Hello, hello. How is everyone? It's been yet another very long week full of election day and courtroom drama and crazy weather, but it's Friday, so cheers. We are here this evening with New York Times bestselling author Adam Goodheart, whose new book, Lost Island, tells the story of a very different world. In November of 2018, a young American missionary kayaked out onto North Sentinel Island, a small island that is part of the Andamans in the Indian Ocean, and he was killed by indigenous islanders wielding bows and arrows. Most people were unaware such a place existed in our time, an island whose hunter-gatherer inhabitants still live in near total isolation. Adam will be in conversation with author and photojournalist Tom Clynes. Adam Goodheart is a historian, a travel writer, an essayist, and the author of The Last Island, Discovery, Defiance, and the Most Elusive Tribe on Earth. He lives in Washington, D.C., and is on the eastern shore of Maryland, where he is a director of Washington College's Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience. Adam is featured in a 2-hour National Geographic documentary about North Sentinel Island, The Mission, premiering in theaters and streaming in late 2023. Adam Goodhart's first book, was the New York Times bestseller in 1861, A Civil War Awakening. It was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in History and was named Book of the Year by the History Book Club. The audiobook edition won the Audio Award for Best History Title of the Year. Author and photojournalist Tom Clynes travels the world covering the adventurous sides of science, the environment, and education for publications such as National Geographic, Nature, the New York Times, and Popular Science, where he is a contributing editor. Tom is the author of the books Wild Planet and The Boy Who Played with Fusion, and he lives in Vermont. Welcome, Tom and Adam.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me. And from where I'm sitting, I'm visiting friends in Virginia, and I'm looking out the window at the sun setting over the Blue Ridge Mountains. And so I feel almost like I'm in Vermont, looking at your mountains. So virtually, I feel like I'm very much with you.
It's so it's 5 o'clock where you are too, and this is my first literary cocktail hour, and the whole thing kind of reminds me of what my dad used to say when he was being a little naughty. It's got to be 5 o'clock somewhere when you crack a beer a little early. So wherever you're joining us from, I hope you're having a relaxing afternoon or evening. And it is definitely 5 o'clock here in the Green Mountains of Vermont.
Did you pour yourself a cocktail before this started? I'm wishing I'd done that. All I have is a glass of water here, and I'm guessing some of our guests have something a little bit more fun.
Well, you might have to just yell at somebody to grab you something. but cheers. Cheers, Adam. And cheers to Sandy and Jerry Carboni too, who's running the behind the scenes tech work. I'm really, really happy to have the chance to talk with you, Adam. I really love this book, and I've got a lot of questions for you, and we'll probably just get to a small fraction of them, and we're probably going to leave some room for some questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, there is a Q&A button that you can click, and I think people can even sort of promote questions that they like to the top of the queue or something in there too. So yeah, the Last Island, I found it just really beguiling and of course at times disturbing and just beautifully written. And we'll focus a lot on the book, but I feel like just bigger picture in terms of the kinds of subjects that we write about and the kinds of places that attract us. You and I have some overlap, and I'm just wondering, what are the common denominators in terms of the subjects that draw you in and the kinds of questions you're trying to answer, and maybe what is it about your character that pulls you towards certain subjects and certain places?
Well, I guess I was, when I think about the roots of this project in particular, I was the kind of bookish and dreamy kid, but the kind of kid who also liked to go out and explore in the woods. who was entranced by the books of people like Robert Louis Stevenson or C.S. Lewis's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which was my absolute favorite book when I was growing up. Just that story of these kids setting out and literally sailing to the edge of the known world. So I loved tales of adventure, tales of discovery and exploration. I've always been entranced by history. And as I got older, I started to read somewhat more complicated tales of discovery and exploration, books by Herman Melville and Joseph Conrad. And in college, I studied with the great historian and literary critic Stephen Greenblatt, who's written really interestingly about this history. And I began to develop a much more complicated and nuanced sense of what exploration and discovery really meant and how they often have gone hand in hand with colonization, with imperialism, with racism, with a number of the worst sins that humanity is heir to. And so it's sort of it's a story that I think combines both the worst human impulses and the best human impulses, our impulses to discover and explore and learn. So that's part of what fascinates me. I'm also really interested, I'm not just a historian, but somebody who looks for history in the present day. I'm fascinated by places in the world where the present feels sort of translucent. You can look through it and the past is clearly visible. And I felt like that was very much the case with the story of The Last Island as well, the story that became this book.
So North Sentinel Island in the Andaman Islands, way out in the Indian Ocean, it's a place that most of us probably wouldn't even be able to find on a map. It's not easy to get there. It's a really long way from anywhere. And in many ways, it's still pristine, or at least much of it. And you have, on one of the islands, a hunter-gatherer culture that's living in voluntary isolation. We used to say uncontacted, but because it's so unusual for any sort of community to be really uncontacted, voluntary isolation is the term that's sort of evolving now. Somehow they've managed to hold out on this island that just slipped through the net of history. And you visited there twice. So I'm wondering, what was it that captivated you about this place and drew you there the first time?
So I was in my late 20s. I had just started my career as a journalist, and I heard about this place. There was very little information available about it at the time, and it was in the early days of the internet. Now you can Google North Sentinel Island, and perhaps some of our viewers have, and you can literally find YouTube videos with hundreds of millions of views that are about the place that don't actually land on the island, but that are sort of people talking about it. In those days, there was very little, and so I came across a stray reference to an island in a remote corner of the Indian Ocean, where there was a tribe that lived that was still completely out of touch with the rest of the world, and in fact, they were believed to be the last sort of truly uncontacted group of people in the world. And I was just fascinated with this story, first of all, because this was history that had fascinated me, and I had no idea that the age of discovery was still playing itself out in one place in the world. And also, I think there was a sort of a romantic desire as an adventurous 20-something to go and see this island with my own eyes, possibly even see the people there with my own eyes. And when I read that the people would shoot intruders with bows and arrows often when they tried to land, that only made me more interested. I also came across an article in an anthropological journal that was written about a man who had gone there repeatedly over the years in an attempt to make contact with the natives, and had managed to make a few little inroads into this island, had managed actually to get to a point where he waded into the surf, and the natives from the island came out, and he handed them bananas and coconuts, and they had a sort of a wary but friendly interaction. So I also knew that I wanted to meet this person and hear his story. So all of that impelled me to set sail for the Andaman Islands in 1998.
I think
And
you've got
if
some
you want,
photos.
I can show you. Yeah, why don't I do that now? I can show people what this place actually looks like. So this is North Sentinel Island, and as you can see, it's sort of a dream of a tropical island in many ways. This sort of deep, thick jungle with, you can't tell here, but they're just towering trees, enormous centuries-old trees, which are part of what makes the people there so mysterious, that even with drones, even with satellites or helicopters, it's really hard to see much of what's going on beneath that tree canopy. And it's ringed by kind of pristine white sand beaches and a lagoon with coral reefs that are still in fairly good shape around it. And so it just looks like a kind of a tropical paradise. Although as I learned, as I came to dig into the story of this island and its history and its possible future, I found that it's much more complicated than that. So I'll show you where this place is. It's in the Andaman Islands, which if you look down at the lower right, you can see that we're in sort of the upper right-hand corner of the Indian Ocean. And it's an archipelago with one big island that you see in the middle there, and then lots of smaller islands scattered around. In fact, there are hundreds of small islands scattered through this chain, including, you can see there in the middle left, North Sentinel Island. So it's kind of an isolated archipelago. It's sort of a lonely island in the midst of this archipelago, but it's not actually that far away from places that have been settled and colonized by the quote unquote modern human beings. And I use that term very cautiously because, of course, these inhabitants of North Sentinel Island are equally citizens of the world in the year 2023. So this is a part of the world. It isn't newly discovered. It's not a place like the West Indies or the South Sea Islands that Europeans only quote unquote discovered in relatively recent times. It's been known since ancient times, but it's also a place that was always for outsiders deeply invested with myth and with a lot of untruths. And so this is a map from the Middle Ages reflecting what people thought of these islands at the time. And there's actually right front and center in this map, there's a label in Latin where it says all of the inhabitants of these islands are cannibals, which isn't true, but there's a sort of a myth that the people on these islands are ready to eat anyone from the outside. The island chain was settled in the 19th century by the British, and I can talk about that a little bit more later, but the British Empire swallowed up the whole archipelago and created on that large island a penal colony where they sent the people from the Indian mainland who were sort of rebelling against the British imperial government. And they also began having contacts with the native people of many of the islands in the Andaman chain. And you can see here what the Andamanese look like. They're very distinctive looking people. They don't look like other South Asians or Southeast Asians. They're very dark skinned. They're quite short, almost sort of like African pygmies. And the British saw these people and decided that they were the lowest people on the scale of humanity in the world. And in my book, I talk about the way that these tribes people were portrayed by and slandered by European science in the wake of Charles Darwin. So the British had contact with the other Andamanese, but they didn't have contact with the people of North Sentinel Island, or didn't have very much contact. Really, the first time that they came to the attention of the world at large was in the early 1970s, when National Geographic actually sent a photographer there to who was doing a larger story about the Andaman Islands. He was accompanying an Indian film crew that wanted to get footage of the Andamanese. And as they approached the beach, the natives came down to the beach, shot arrows at the film crew, and an arrow actually went through the thigh of the film director from National Geographic. They beat a hasty retreat, and they published this article in National Geographic. And I think now, almost 50 years later, the editors of National Geographic have a lot of mixed feelings about this coverage that they gave, because it really helped to cement the image of these islanders as kind of angry indigenous people and very hostile people. But over the years, in fact, whenever others tried to land on the island, as often as not, the Sentinelese would come out and start shooting arrows at them. This is an image that was taken in 2005, shortly after the Indian Ocean tsunami, and a Coast Guard helicopter from the Indian Coast Guard. So these islands now are an offshore territory of India. Coast Guard helicopter flew overhead to check on the natives, and this man came out and started shooting arrows at the helicopter. So these are the images that the world has seen, basically, the only images that the world has seen of the Sentinelese. I ended up going there myself in 1998. You can read more about it in my book, but no one is allowed to approach the island. There's a wide exclusion zone around it, but I actually bribed some local fishermen to take me there in their small boat. We circled around the island. We saw the natives coming down to the beach a few hundred yards away. And we had a close encounter, and then a monsoon storm came in and almost drowned us. And it was a whole adventure that I write about in my book. It was more of an adventure than I bargained for when I went there. And here you can see those gigantic trees and what the island looks like as one approaches. So I'll stop there and we can just talk a little bit.
Those are just amazing shots. One tidbit I remember from the book is that they were thought to be cannibals by outsiders, at which they weren't, and still presumably aren't. But one thing that you can see where people got the idea is that they have a custom, not necessarily on North Sentinel, but throughout the Andaman Islands, of people wearing either the jaw bones or the entire skulls of deceased relatives tied around their necks.
Mm-hmm. That's right. In fact, I'll try to pull up a photo that I have of a young woman doing just that. I mean, they're not cannibals, but there's no question that they are a very unusual and distinctive culture. And by the way, I think it's important to clarify for people who haven't read my book that I'm talking now about the islanders in the rest of the archipelago, not North Sentinel Island specifically, but sort of generally the Andamanese indigenous people to whom they're closely related. So these are people who speak languages that are unrelated to any other languages in the world. They're people who genetically, from the very few studies that have been able to be done on them, have been separated from the rest of the human race for as much as 70,000 years. They're people who still live as hunter-gatherers, who don't know how to make fire, apparently, who don't really have math. Their languages don't number above the number 2. They apparently have no form of organized religious worship, although they have a very rich culture and rich spiritual life and a lot of very complicated beliefs and histories and visual culture. But they really are a very distinctive and unusual group of people on these surrounding islands from what we know. And we have every reason to believe that the Sentinelese as well probably share some of the same characteristics of these other islanders.
It sounds like there's still more that we don't know about these cultures than we know about them. And it was interesting that in some cases some of the people who were semi-assimilated into cultures would actually mess around with the anthropologists and kind of trick them. And in one passage you talk about an interview where there was a flower and they were asking the word for flower, and it wasn't until years later they figured out that they had given the researchers the name for poop just to mess around with their heads.
Yeah, so there are these accounts from the Brits in the 19th century when they came into these islands in the late 1850s. It was sort of just at the moment of the flowering of the new discipline of anthropology. And it was also right at the time that Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species came out. And so the British were fascinated with the people in these islands. And They thought that, they said that these are the sort of the most primitive people on the entire scale of humanity. And some people thought that it actually proved the theory of evolution correct, because they said, well, clearly, if there are different levels of human beings, then that supports the idea that our species has evolved. So a lot of the science that was practiced was not just wrong, but cruel and racist and terrible. But you do find these accounts, as you say, of the islanders kind of messing with the outsiders in a way that makes you smile.
So 22 years after your first trip, you went back to the Andaman Islands. And that decision was based, at least in part, on an incident that made international news and that I think a lot of us will remember. It was just, 5 years ago, 2018, that an American missionary decided he needed to go there and convert the heathens of North Sentinel Island to Christianity. And even though they made it very clear that was something they would not be interested in, by showering anyone who approached with volleys of arrows, he got a kayak and paddled to the island and landed on the beach. And the encounter did not go well. Why don't you tell us what happened?
Yeah, perhaps some of our viewers remember it. And for those who don't, I can actually show a couple of images from that event. Nope. So some people may remember these headlines from when this young man was actually killed on the beach. So this man, John Allen Chow, who had gone to Oral Roberts University and was deeply involved in the American evangelical movement, the international missionary movement, which is a lot of people think of that as something from the 19th century, but it's still very active today. To this day, about 3/4 of the world's population are not Christians, even though some Americans may find that hard to believe. But there's a very organized movement to convert those other 6 billion people. And one of these evangelical groups had actually sponsored John Chow to go to North Sentinel Island and try to convert these just at most a couple of hundred people. So he did something similar to what I did. And in fact, we know that he had read the article that I published 20 years earlier about my trip to North Sentinel Island. So I suspect he was inspired by what I did. He went to the same place and found some fishermen and paid them to take him to the waters near the island. But unlike me, I went and we just circled around the island and stayed outside the reef. Unlike me, he had brought a folding kayak with him, unfolded it, paddled to the beach, took out a waterproof Bible. I mean, you couldn't make up some of these details, but he took out a rubber-coated Bible and started reading to these people from the book of Genesis in English when they came down to the beach. To make a long story short, they chased him off the first time. And then the second time that he came back, a boy actually shot an arrow and it pierced into the waterproof Bible and struck Isaiah chapter 63. He was careful to note. And then the third time, it was almost, it's almost like a fairy tale where the third time is the fatal one. The third time that he came back, he did not return to the fishing boat. And in fact, the fishermen saw the natives dragging his body across the beach, and presumably they had killed him with their arrows or their spears. So this really, as you can see, it made worldwide news. Hundreds of millions of people were fascinated by it. It was on the front page of the New York Times for several days. And people just interpreted it in very different ways. Some people saw him, and some people still see him as a hero, as a martyr for Christ. And he's become a sort of celebrity within this evangelical community. A lot of people see him as something else. His death, as tragic as it was, and I do empathize with him in many respects, even though I don't agree with what he did. But as tragic as his death was, it spawned sort of 1,000 memes. And you can see some of the things that were posted that were very cruel, really for people across the political spectrum. So a lot of people on the left saw him as just an example of the worst folly and hubris of colonizers and religious proselytizers. People on the right actually hailed the Sentinelese as sort of champions of cultural purity and the strongest form of anti-immigrant sentiment. This happened not too long before COVID broke, and during COVID, there was sort of a new rash of attention paid to this story, and people who decided that they were the social isolation champions of the world, the Sentinelese were. So it kind of fascinated the other 8 billion people on the planet to the point where Justin Lin, who's the director of the Fast and Furious series, is currently apparently shooting a movie about this story. And there's also this National Geographic special that's been shot that's in theaters across the country right now and will be streaming later this fall. So it became a kind of a meme, a viral sensation. And I actually decided that I would return to the story in the wake of John Chow's death, because it was clear that there was a lot of curiosity about the island. I started getting contacted by a lot of people. And this story, this long article that I had published 20 years before, had really kind of more than anything else that I've ever published in a magazine, it had a sort of a life of its own. It kind of developed a cult following over the years. Not only John Chow himself, but other people were fascinated by it and would email me and just want to know more about the story and tell me how much it had moved them and how much they appreciated the account that I gave of these people and the historical context that I gave to it. So I decided that in light of this new attention that they were getting, much of it very glib and facile and uninformed, it would be valuable for me to write a book that would take a somewhat deeper and more historically grounded and more nuanced look at this incredible story.
So this sort of cultural and religious chauvinism has led to the destruction and degradation of so many cultures, both here in the Americas and all over the world. In this case, the colonial authorities, both the British and the Indian government, they sort of vacillated between trying to bring the inhabitants of the islands into the fold of the dominant civilization and protecting them from being destroyed by it. And you can really see how the decisions of local leaders could change the course of the civilizations as one tribal group after another was brought in with often disastrous results, disease and just terrible sorts of outcomes. So I'm wondering, if you could just tell us a little bit about how that played out over the years, that push and pull between trying to bring them in and trying to protect them.
Yeah, as I delved into the story of North Sentinel Island, what I really came to discover was that these are people who in many ways have slipped through the net of a terrible history, or actually slipped through the net might not be fair to them. They have really managed to survive, managed to escape through courage and through resourcefulness to remain uncontacted, while all around them, these other islands were explored, in some cases were colonized, and outsiders made contact with the native people, and it often had just disastrous, if not genocidal results. So I ended up delving deep into the archives of the 19th century British Empire and discovering these stories that are sort of worthy of Joseph Conrad, of this island chain that was a penal colony and was a kind of an imperial heart of darkness. I mean, you look at some of the photos of what was going on there in the 19th century, and it just looks like it's something from, a film. You have these sort of almost naked convicts who 4 of them would carry a sedan chair with some minor British official in sort of an immaculate white linen suit and a pith helmet riding around. I mean, it was just kind of straight out of central casting of the British Empire. And they went in with, in some ways, the best of intentions. They certainly said that they didn't want to hurt the natives. They said that they wanted to befriend the natives. They said, some of them, they wanted to bring all the benefits of civilization to the natives. But in the process, really what they brought was cultural destruction, European diseases, violence, degradation, sexual abuse, all of the things that we're all too familiar with from other places. So in some ways, as I researched this book, it quickly became apparent that the story of North Sentinel Island, the story of the Andaman Islands, is a kind of a microcosm for the history of imperialism and colonization in many, many places around the world.
Yeah, you know, one of the best things about this book, and I encourage everybody to get it and read it, is the characters that you bring into it. Many of them British colonial characters. And to me, the most memorable was someone named Maurice Portman. He was sort of a ne'er-do-well from a rich English family who was sent off to what you might call a hardship post in the British Foreign Service, and becomes the officer in charge of the Andamanese natives. Once he gets there, he becomes a sort of gentleman anthropologist, I suppose, and he decides to make it his business to learn everything he can about the remote tribes on the islands, basically by trying to make friends with them. And there's official records of his contacts with them, which are pretty dry, but it's not until you visit the rare book collection of the British Library in London that you come across a sort of shadow text. And this is a really dark, I guess, parallel narrative that you describe as, I'm quoting you here, kind of a dreamscape of science, violence, sex, drugs, and power. Like so much of the Andaman Islands, it seemed to exist in a very narrow space between dream and nightmare, method and madness. Now, there's plenty of weird stuff in this book, but this is where the going gets really weird in the book. Take us into Portman's story a little bit.
Yeah, so this guy, you know, in many ways, when you start to read about him, and when you read just his published work, he's incredibly impressive in many respects. This is a guy whose formal schooling stopped mysteriously and suddenly when he was 16 years old. He came from one of the wealthiest aristocratic families in Britain, but ended up in basically the worst job and the worst place in the entire British Empire. And while he was there, in many respects, he made the most of it. He published thousands of pages of history, of linguistics, of sort of early anthropology. He learned multiple languages, these incredibly difficult languages with sort of trills and clicks for which there were no lexicons and no Berlitz courses at the time. And he not only did he learn them and become fluent, but he wrote lexicons of these languages. He also was an explorer who mapped some of the remote reaches of this archipelago and was very brave traveling on his own to places that were unexplored or where the tribes were known to be very hostile to outsiders. And finally, he also became a photographer, an early photographer. And I'll show you in a moment a few of his photos, but he took some photos that were absolutely visually stunning. So in many regards, he comes across as this sort of admirable, if not heroic figure. But as I delved deeper into his story, and as I found some of his very rare private papers that were previously unidentified by scholars, and as I found some of his unpublished photographs, it became clear that he was, well, to say a complicated man, I think would be the least of it. He was a sort of an awful figure in some ways who ended up reminding me of Joseph Conrad's Kurtz from Heart of Darkness. And I can show you Portman. I'll share that again. So here he is, and I think you can get a sense, even just from this image, of the kind of man he was. I mean, it's just an absolutely chilling image. Here's this sort of mere slip of a boy. I mean, he may still have been in his teens when this photo was taken, and just sitting literally enthroned with his sword and surrounded by a couple dozen indigenous people over whom he clearly feels like the overlord. And some of them are dressed up in those weird surplices with the crosses. And no scholars were able to sort of figure out what this photo meant, even though it had been published once or twice before. And I discovered that Portman actually founded a Masonic order called the August Order of Light. And he appointed himself to the title of Grand Sacred Hierophant in the East. So here he is. I think he's kind of in his Grand Sacred Hierophant role. So he's sort of setting himself up as a kind of a king in these tropical islands over these natives that he clearly views as inferior. So I also, when I was in the British Library, and I'll show you in a moment an image from one of these books, I was in the British Library in London doing research, and I in the way that one does as a historian, I came in with a whole bunch of different things that I knew I wanted to look at, spent a week or so looking at them. Then I had a little bit of time left at the end, and so I said, well, I'm sort of all done with my hit list, but I'll call up one or two other random documents from the collection. And I had found in the catalog something that said, Diary of an Unidentified Medical Officer in the Andaman Islands, 1880s. So I thought, well, you know, it doesn't sound terribly relevant, but maybe there will be some kind of a reference to these stories that I'm investigating. So I filled out the call slip, and they brought me these 2 volumes, and I quickly realized it was the very private diary of Maurice Portman. And so I discovered the flip side of these accounts that he was publishing as a travel writer. And as you say, I won't give too much of it away, but it was a sort of a nightmare dreamscape of sex and death and madness and power, and some of it fairly explicit about the relationships that he was having with some of these natives, and the way that he was a sort of a colonial overlord. In fact, I found an account by another English person who visited the islands some years after Portman and interviewed the natives about him. And her account was he gave the natives champagne and taught them to ride bicycles, relieved with frequent beatings. So that was the kind of story that this was. So incredibly complicated story, incredibly dark story. But at the same time, I was just entranced by the photographs that Portman made in the 1890s. So you can see these are kind of large-scale platinum prints, and they're just stunningly beautiful in their tonality. They also just have a real sense of poignancy and empathy to them. I recently spoke with Errol Morris, the Academy Award-winning documentary filmmaker, who was an early reader of my book, and he said that he thought that Portman's images were some of the most stunning photographs he's ever seen. And I think coming from Errol Morris, that's really, really something. So you can just get a sense of a real humane quality with many of these photographs. And you also get a sense that he was perhaps eroticizing some of the natives, which I found more evidence of in his diaries. But then suddenly you turn the page and you find these images of sort of a clinical and creepy anthropological quality. And I go a lot into the background of 19th century anthropology and his and other scientists' interaction with the natives. So in other words, this is kind of the web of history that the Sentinelese have managed so far largely to escape. I also found some of the photographs that he didn't actually publish and didn't intend to publish, but this is one of his original glass plate negatives that's still preserved in the British Museum in the original boxes in which he shipped them from the Andaman Islands. And you can get a sense from this kind of ghostly image of the way that he was fetishizing and eroticizing some of these indigenous men and dressing them up in costumes of his own invention. Those are not Andamanese ornaments. Those are things that he had apparently created in his photographic studio. And this is a page from his diaries, and I had to learn to read this really difficult pencil scrawl. He clearly wrote these books not intending for anyone but himself to ever look at them, and so they're scrawled in pencil and lots of abbreviations and sort of code words and 19th century British imperial slang. So it was quite a job to start to make heads or tails of them, but I managed to do that. So that's just a little glimpse. And as you say, my book, The Last Island, really ends up being a work that sort of intertwines a travel book with a work of history. And I'd say that's something that's very characteristic of my writing in general, and that's something that readers have really responded to so far. And I think it's characteristic of a lot of the work that you do as well, Tom.
And I should note that these pictures, all of them that you showed us, are in the book.
Yes.
And more too.
Yeah, many more.
And I think Portman's story and story of some of the others really gets at some of the perils of trying to understand an isolated culture, and even when you have good intentions, and the curiosity that's drawn people to do things often that put the target people at risk. And you yourself were drawn by some of that same curiosity, and to do it, to satisfy it, I suppose you needed to do some things clandestinely and kind of bend the official rules. Yeah. So I'm wondering, what were the rules that you set for yourself to make sure that your presence didn't have a negative impact on these fragile cultures?
So, some of this book is actually pretty self-critical. And when I went there in 1998, I was a different person than I am now. I was sort of a brash 20-something, and now I'm a few years older than that. And I've got different ideas now, and I think I understand now more than I did then just how much I was not only putting myself at risk, but also putting at risk the people who were brave enough to take me to the waters off North Sentinel Island, who also almost died in this storm. But also, if we had been driven onto the beach, I might well have endangered the lives of the Sentinelese themselves. So that's something that I can really criticize now with a bit of distance. I can also criticize the way I even looked at these people. My desire to see them with my own eyes. So when I went back there in 2020, just weeks before COVID shut the world down, it was as a very different person. And I did not go back. I did not break the law. I didn't go back to the waters off North Sentinel Island. I did talk to people in the islands who were able to share with me the plight of the indigenous people today. And there's a good bit about that in my book. I won't delve too deep into that now, but I write about some of the other indigenous tribes that do have contact with the outside world to varying degrees, and the history that's unfolding for them right now. So yeah, it's a book that I hope actually will awaken people ultimately to the plight of indigenous people around the world, and awaken readers to the knowledge that, when we think about these discoveries that result in colonization and genocide and cultural destruction, this isn't a story that happened in 1492 or in 1830. This is something that's playing itself out still in our world today, in numerous places in our world. And our culture really hasn't fully reckoned with our responsibility in situations like this, and with how we need to approach these scenarios, and how we really need to approach people like the Sentinelese.
This is, it's a almost unique situation, I suppose. And we have a question that kind of gets at that, which is, it comes from Connie. Have the people on the other islands commented on the Sentinelese? And I think she means the other native people, the other indigenous people. Can you answer that?
Yeah, so surprisingly, it seems like the people on the other islands really haven't had contact with the Sentinelese within generations. But they do actually have stories and legends about the Sentinelese. And one of the legends actually is that the world was created at North Sentinel Island. So it's seen even by the other people from the different Aboriginal tribes in the Andamans as being a kind of a magical, mystical, mysterious place. We do know that their languages are far enough away from what we've heard of the Sentinelese tongue that it probably is impossible for them to talk to each other. I saw there was also a question, do they fish for food and go out in boats or interact with fishermen? And maybe this is a good time for me to address Moss Kaler's question. So they do have these small dugout canoes, and they're able to use these canoes to just set out into the lagoon. And when I circled the island, they did that, actually. I saw a couple of them coming out in a dugout canoe, but the canoes are too fragile to actually put out into the open water and cross. The nearest island is about 30 miles away, so they aren't able to go out to the nearby islands. They do fish for food a lot, and in fact, one of the remarkable achievements of the Sentinelese is that they're actually seen shooting fish in the water with their bows and arrows very proficiently. They have these incredibly powerful wooden bows with bark skin cores that they use. And imagine how difficult it is to shoot a fish in the water, but they're able to do that. They live by the bow and arrow. And that really brings us to the question of what the future of these people might be. And hunter-gatherers are so dependent on their surroundings, so dependent on their environment and on other species. And so there's every reason to think that as climate change happens, as mass extinction happens, degradation of the oceans, overfishing, that's got to have an impact on the ability of these people to survive even in their isolation.
You've just got such a great eye for a story and an ear for a story. And your last book, 1861, which was about some of the untold stories that led up to the Civil War, I hadn't read it, but it was really well reviewed, and it became a bestseller. And so that gets me curious, what's next for you if you want to talk about it? Have you got another book project coming up?
I do, and I'll say with The Last Island that it hasn't been a bestseller yet. It's sort of had a quiet launch. I'm hearing from a lot of readers who have found it and loved it, but it hasn't been widely reviewed. And I'm sort of hearing that that's because people think, oh, it's a sort of a faraway island in the Indian Ocean. Readers probably won't be as excited as they would be for another book about Abraham Lincoln. And I think that's a shame. I think it's a shame that more Americans aren't as interested in this history. But I am finding that the book has just been published in India, and it's getting a fair amount of attention there. And so I'm really glad that the book is going to be part of the conversation in India about these people. And I think it'll also be part of the conversation. I hope it'll be part of the conversation for years to come. People who have read it have told me that this is a book that they will really remember and cherish and share with other people. And so I see it as a book that I hope will have an impact going into the future on the way that people think about the indigenous tribes around the world. And a book that'll have an impact on the way that we think about our own situation, because some of the book ends up being a kind of a meditation on connection and isolation in the contemporary world. In terms of my other work, I wrote the book 1861, and I'm actually now midway through the book 1865, which is about the very end of the Civil War and what came after it. Seems like it's kind of different and distant from North Sentinel Island in some respects, which it is, but it actually is work that intersects with similar issues of race and power and the struggle for freedom and autonomy. I definitely am centering the story of African Americans, as I did in 1861 in that book as well. I'm also talking about the 19th century, of course, as I do in the book The Last Island, and that's just a time in history that perennially fascinates me. It's sort of the time that's just beyond the cusp of current human memory, and in many ways feels like a very alien and irretrievable world, and yet also is a world that still does so much to shape the identity of our own times and the history of our own times. And we've seen in recent years, certainly, the way that memories of the 1860s are still front and center in our national politics. So that's the book that I'm in the thick of right now, although given my academic job and other stuff, it's probably going to be another couple of years before it comes out. So I hope in the meantime people will enjoy The Last Island.
I love your reporting process. I mean, you're both an intrepid traveler. You get out to places where other people don't go. And you also know your way around a rare book room or a library or a museum in a way that I don't think I ever will. And I'm just curious for other people who have interest in writing and doing historical writing, you know, how do you get that? What sort of training do you have, or did you give yourself to be able to find your way around archives so well?
Well, I think I try to bring this. It's a great question, Tom. I appreciate that, and I hope there are other writers who are watching who will find it interesting. But I really try to bring to both some of the same approaches and same instincts. And there's that famous saying, "The past is a foreign country," and I think about that a lot as I do my historical research, because I try to approach the past as if it were a foreign land that, when we're traveling in another country, we're astonished at one moment by how familiar things feel and these moments of connection that we make with the native inhabitants and where we realize our common humanity. And then in the next moment, we'll be sort of equally astonished and sometimes delighted or sometimes taken aback by just how different and foreign it is, and how differently people's minds work in other cultures, how different language is, and how different politics is. And so it's that sort of familiarity and strangeness as being two sides of the same coin that I understand about the past. And I go into an archive much as I go to a foreign country, trying to bring out for my eventual readers a sense of vignettes, of little snatches of detail and language and characters that'll really transport them to that place. I want my books to really be immersive and for people to feel like they're plunged into another time or another place. So I think that's the common thread that I can identify.
Well, I think you really succeeded with this book, so bravo.
Thank you.
So just to wrap it up, you told me earlier you got a crazy travel schedule coming up in the next week and promoting the book. And I know we've got people in the audience from all over the country. So just, can you tell me where you're going to be in the next few weeks in case somebody happens to be in one of the cities you're visiting?
So way too early tomorrow morning, I'm flying out to San Francisco, and there are actually 2 screenings of the National Geographic film, The Mission, which I highly recommend. It's by very accomplished filmmakers, Jesse Moss and Amanda McBain, and they really delve deep into the story of John Allen Chow. So that's now screening in select cinemas, as they say, around the country, including San Francisco. So I'm doing a couple of events there. Then I'm coming back to the East Coast, and I'll be in New York City on Friday evening at 6 o'clock at the main branch of the New York Public Library at 42nd and 5th Avenue, doing a conversation with Manoush Zomorodi from NPR. And then the next morning, far too early, I'm flying to Miami, and I'm doing an event at the Miami Book Fair next Sunday. So it's going to be, I'm not traveling quite as far as the Andaman Islands, but there will be thousands of miles of travel in the next week. And I would love to hear from anybody who's able to make it.
Wow.
I also was going to say that, I really like opportunities to interact with readers when I do live events and opportunities to sign books for people. And so one of the things that I do if I do a virtual event like this one is I invite people to write to me if they've bought a copy of the book, and I'll send them a properly inscribed and autographed book plate that they can put in their copy. So I would be happy to do that for anybody who's watching right now. You can find my email address pretty easily just by Googling me.
Oh, that's really generous. That's
Perfect.
fantastic.
Signed books are great holiday gifts, right?
That's true. Holidays are coming up faster than we want. So
It's getting to be that time
so
of year.
Thank you so much, Tom. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to reading more of your work. And thank you to the organizers of the festival, and thanks to everybody who joined us here tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Adam and Tom. That was fabulous. So fascinating, honestly.
Thank you, Sandy, and also to Jerry in the background doing the behind-the-scenes tech work, and the whole organization. The Brattleboro Literary Festival is a fantastic event, and it's so great that we're able to work on the margins of the actual in-person event and do this kind of thing. So bravo.
Well, I love Vermont, and I would love to visit in person next time. So maybe we can talk about that in the future, and we can meet.
Sure, you bet.
Great.
Love the host, yeah.
So our next event is going to be actually live, which is December 1st, and it's the first film of the new Banned Books to Film series that we're going to do with Epsilon Spires, and it's the Truffaut classic film Fahrenheit 451, speaking of book banning. And so that'll be really interesting. I haven't seen that book I've seen a book. I haven't seen a movie in a million years. I've seen the book more recently. And then we have a literary cocktail hour scheduled on December 8th. Not quite ready to announce that yet, but will be soon. And so that's what's happening here. And thanks everybody for joining us, and have a great weekend.
Thank you so much. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Good night.
Night.